I spent a lot of time trying to make sense of this book, and there are a lot of ways to understand it. Some of it's pretty challenging. Just take a look at this passage from the prophet Isaiah, talking about a future filled with peace. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. These words were written something like 2,700 years ago. So why would we take them seriously? And what would happen if we did? Well, my guest today, Moana Cole, does just that. Her life and her actions are based not just on these words, but on her understanding of the Bible as a whole. And some of those actions, in particular the invasion of an American Air Force base on the eve of the First Gulf War, have had a serious cost for her, though she prefers to see it as a gift, the chance to share now in Isaiah's vision of the future.
Well, we did our action 15 days before the deadline to war, 16 days before the war actually started. We knew that there'd be a lot of civilian casualties. We knew a lot of men, women and children would be killed. So when we walked onto that base in the early hours of the morning, it felt right. It was World Day of Peace on that particular day. The readings of the day were the swords into plowshares reading and the love your enemies passage from Jesus. We felt we were enfleshing that, and we felt that in those circumstances it was where we needed to be. Well, we walked onto Griffiths Air Force Base. Myself and Kieran O'Reilly, who was from Australia, went to the end of the runway. We spray painted on that runway, no more bombing of children, Hiroshima, Vietnam, the Middle East or anywhere else, love your enemies, beat swords into plowshares. We took a baby's bottle that had been filled with blood. We poured blood in the shape of a cross on the runway. We announced that the runway does not end here at Griffiths Air Force Base, but it would end in the deaths of lots of men, women and children. And we took with us a sledgehammer and a hammer and began to dismantle the edges of the runway. Meanwhile, Sue and Bill, who were from the United States, were at the other end of the runway. They managed to get through 3 security fences to B-52, which was sitting at the end of the runway. It was fully loaded with air-launched cruise missiles. The engine was running. They managed to get past a security vehicle, take hammers and hammer on the fuselage of that plane and unfurl a banner saying "Swords into plowshares."
More recently, here in New Zealand, you've been associated with the defence, in particular, of the Waihopai Three, who broke into the spy base near Blenheim and also inflicted damage. What was your role in that?
I was asked to come in and be part of their defence team. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to continue that on because I had a baby and so went on as a supporter.
So what kind of defence is there for someone like the Waihopai Three?
Well, there's probably a few defences, but the most commonly used defence is what's called the necessity defence. So basically the analogy that is used is that if you break and enter into a burning building to rescue children, you might be committing the crime of break and entry, but you're doing it for the greater good to rescue children from a burning building. So in the necessity defence, you have to prove that a greater crime is being committed and that you were doing the action to prevent that greater crime.
Isn't there a danger, I guess, if I decide that I'm preventing a greater crime, that I'm misguided?
Well, I think that you have to go back to what the facts of the case are. The Waihopai Three argued that Waihopai was part of a system of spying, essentially, that was very instrumental in the war on terror, which has resulted in the deaths of a lot of people. In particular, they were focusing on Iraq. So you really have to look at what these three men did. Their action was very limited in that they cut down the dome, and compared that to what they were trying to prevent, which is and continues to be the wholesale slaughter of people in Iraq.
Do you find the accused, Peter Reginald Leo Murnane, guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
The accused may leave the dock, having been found not guilty and willing to the trial.
All of this, the Griffiths experience, the Waihopai experience, your legal commitment now, it all speaks of a real passion for social justice. Where did that come from in your case?
My father was in the Merchant Navy and he was a master of a ship. He was allowed to take his family on board, so for the first 5 years of my life we were at sea. Eventually we settled in Queensland, and at that time it was run by the very infamous Joe Bjelke-Petersen, who had gerrymandered the whole political system, and it was a very strong clampdown on all civil liberties.
Your mother was quite caught up with a politically active role.
Yes, she was an organiser for the Labour Party in Queensland, which meant that she was on the enemy firing line as far as the Bjelke-Petersen government was concerned. She was also involved in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island rights. She was very interested in the issues around education, so she got caught up in a lot of political issues in Queensland at the time.
Was there a personal cost in that?
Yes, for them there was, in terms of my father worked for the state government, and every time my mother ran a successful political campaign, my father was moved. So he did a lot of travelling around from place to place to place.
So he was
Queensland.
punished effectively?
He was effectively punished. We had our phones tapped, abusive phone calls all the time.
When did you yourself become involved in peace activism?
I guess when I was at university, I was doing film and media studies, looking around at what I could do to make some kind of difference. Picked up a pamphlet one day advertising a protest against nuclear armed and powered nuclear ships coming into town, and decided that I would go along to these meetings. And we blocked off the support vehicles coming in to service that ship. We were very quickly arrested, taken away by the police, and I went to jail and spent time in the watch house for the first time in my life.
Right. When did you put together the commitment to peace and justice on the one hand and spirituality or the religious imperative on the other?
Well, the commitment to peace and justice had always been there. My spiritual development came a bit later, and that was really through the organisers of the first action I did against the New Jersey. And the organisers of that action were the Catholic Worker. They were a group that lived in a very poor area of Brisbane, big Aboriginal population, a lot of ethnic groups. They did a lot of work with the poor, so had a lot of mentally ill live with them. They lived as a community and did a lot of non-violent direct action. They were independent, so they refused to accept any money from the church or the state because they didn't want to be co-opted by anything. And I was very, very taken with this because I was getting interested in the ideas of anarchism, I guess, in terms of being a decentralised oriented movement. And they, to me, practised it in the most authentic way. After my university finished, decided to go over to the United States, where the movement started in 1933. Started off in LA, worked in a soup kitchen there that served 1,500 meals a day. So always lived in poor areas. We're a pacifist movement, so had a lot in LA to do campaigning against the death penalty.
Right.
And running a household of community where you would have guests living with you and looking after the needs of those guests.
Woe to those ensconced so snugly in Zion, and to those who feel so safe on the mountain of Samaria, lying on ivory beds.
Then, of course, I was exposed more and more to the Gospels. And as I went to Mass each week, I guess the spirituality side to me began to unfold. What appealed to me about Catholicism is that it has a long tradition that's 2,000 years old. It's a big church, so it's open to anybody. So whatever you're into, there's a place for you.
There's room for all sorts of variety.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, before God, the source of all life, and before Jesus Christ, who spoke up as a witness for the truth.
What I liked was that there was a place for those who had a passion for peace and justice. So what they did, which was very interesting for me, was to contextualise the Bible. So talk about the time that Jesus lived in, talk about his responses, and then really try to bring it back to here and now.
And that became kind of at the heart of the motivation of Catholic workers.
Yes, yeah, right. Yes.
Because the Bible always interests me for lots of reasons. But one is that it's like statistics, really. You can prove anything with the Bible, and a lot of it depends on the kind of approach you're taking. And it seems to me you're talking about a theological tradition which is inviting a particular response.
Yes, well, theology is faith, seeking understanding. And I think at the end of the day, you've always got to acknowledge that you might be wrong about these things. and that's the beauty of non-violence, that if you're wrong, nobody's going to get hurt. So there's always space for being wrong. Well, in the United States, over 50% of taxpayers' money goes to the military-industrial complex, and that takes away from the poor in particular, who should have funding directed toward them. So we had to challenge that military-industrial complex, and there was also the whole analysis of the United States as an empire.
Right.
And how it was projecting onto the world in very negative ways. And there are a lot of very interesting people, particularly priests and nuns, who are also part of the Catholic worker movement and the ploughshares movement, who had spent time in third world countries, done a lot of service work there, who said, it's time for us to go back home, back to the United States, and really this is where the problem starts, and let's challenge things inside. So great people who are still doing jail time to this day.
Right. And committed to addressing the issue at source.
Absolutely, absolutely.
How did you experience the aspects of spirituality, attending Mass and so on? Was that an easy thing to get inside of, or was that initially strange?
Yeah, I think that when you're not Catholic and you come to Catholicism, you realise that it definitely has its own culture. And even people who are ex-Catholics, to me, are much more Catholic in a lot of ways than I am. So you're a wee bit outside that, and I think that also comes with people's cultural background. So there are Irish Catholics and there are Italian Catholics who play out their Catholicism in certain ways.
How do you feel then about the institutional church? Because we can speak of the church as a counterculture, but a lot of the time, in the West anyway, the church isn't a counterculture. The church is actually almost a defining emblem of the overriding culture.
And that's very much exemplified in the United States. Every Catholic church in the States has an American flag in it. You know, that's outrageous to me. But I see myself very much at the peripheries. I don't get involved too much in the politics of the church because I think I'd become disillusioned. But the church is more than the institution.
Jesus is the model?
Absolutely. Jesus was a non-violent resistor and sided with the poor. The parables show that very clearly, questioned power and authority when it undermined the poor, and was eventually crucified, suffered capital punishment.
And that's the price you pay for confronting power.
Yeah, that is, but it's not only a price, it's an incredible gift. Like, to go ahead and do a ploughshares action is an incredible gift, and it's not all about sacrifice, it's not all about price. And I was lucky enough when I was 20, 21 years old to do this action. It took me into prison. And Gandhi always said, you know, you must enter the prison gates like the bridegroom enters the bridal chamber on his marriage night. and prison was the most educational, the best monastic experience that I can recommend. It made me a much better person. It made me a much more empathetic person. It made me understand the power of institutions. So I see this as an incredible gift. The ploughshares movement takes its inspiration from the prophet Isaiah, and in it he talks about the messianic time, the time of Jesus, so the time of now, where swords will be beaten into ploughshares, spears into pruning hooks, so the weapons of war will be converted into implements that sustain human life. First action was done in 1980. Since then, there's been about 80 ploughshares movements around the world. So it goes beyond lobbying, It goes beyond politically organising and actually just doing it.
I'd say the physical step of beating the spears into ploughshares with hammers.
These things are very scary. You know that they are the right things to do, but we're all human beings. Very, very nervous, got dropped off when it was still dark, hid in the bushes, cut a fence, cross the road, get onto the runway. And this is where you see the spirit move, because when these actions happen, it's in a context where really they shouldn't happen because all the security is in place. How did Bill and Sue get past an armed security person and begin this action? How did they cut through an electric fence? The hand of God. And then, of course, the military came.
They responded very aggressively.
Very aggressive young men who jumped out of moving vehicles and threatened to blow our brains out, and then it's not the time to get into arguments. That can be done down at the court case, and you just cooperated. Went to trial, so we all defended ourselves, although we all had lawyers who would write up the legal arguments for us, which were very unsuccessful. And
what sort of legal arguments were you?
We were looking at the necessity defence. Yeah. Interesting trial. The judge was Catholic, the prosecutor was Catholic, and 4 Catholic defendants. Yep. So probably coming from very different traditions within the church. Yeah.
And in the end, you were all convicted?
In the end, we were convicted and we were all sentenced to a year in prison.
Right.
We had talked a lot about what we would do in prison. So I'd get up in the morning and I'd do a bit of yoga, then I'd have a bit of fiction, and then my political reading, then my theological reading. There's a lot of hours in the day.
Yes.
And of course, you're in with women, a lot of whom can't read or write. They don't understand what charges, helping them write letters to loved ones. So there's a lot of good work you can be doing in prison. and felt like a very authentic place to be during the duration of the Gulf War. And seeing yourself in solidarity, I guess, with the victims of war.
Did it affect at all your sort of fledgling faith?
I remember waking up one day and thinking, oh, I just don't believe anymore. And I identified it as a crisis of faith or some kind of crisis I was going through. I just thought, oh, well, the only thing I know what to do in this situation is just continue the practices. And as quickly as it had gone, it came back again. Yeah, so I was very lucky that I was gifted that back, and that it is a grace-given gift. You know, nothing that I have done. I've done many things to undermine that grace, but, you know, I still have it, and it's a treasure. You know, the irony with us and our lifestyle, I think the freer I have ever felt is the less I've had. You know, and as I inundate myself with more things materially, I think there's great truth in those religious traditions that just say they burden you down and they distract you from the focus. So in a lot of ways, I had an incredible amount of spiritual freedom, much more in a prison cell than I probably have on the outside.
Released from prison, probably can't stay in the States.
No. I was given what was called a voluntary departure, which, so I wasn't deported.
Is that different from deported?
I wasn't deported. So there's always the openness that I can go apply to go back. But given
I imagine you'd be very popular.
Yeah, I don't think I'll ever get back. I think now the third world is probably my limit, and I still have to apply for a visa to get into Australia, which is where my parents live.
Oh, really? Settled in Christchurch, and did you seek to continue your activity?
Yeah, set up a Catholic worker house, the Suzanne Aubert
yes.
Catholic worker house, which continues until this day.
Involved in any direct action in New Zealand?
Yes. The United States military have an Air Force base at Christchurch Airport. It serves some Antarctic, but it also hosts flights that come through and service Pine Gap, which is the largest US military base outside the States. So we object to those flights to go through, and says it makes us complicit
in some way.
in these actions. So did a trespass action at Harewood, was arrested there, went to court, was found guilty and fined. And that was the last piece of direct action that I participated in.
It's interesting you've taken up law.
I needed a trade
Right.
when I came back to New Zealand. So very basically, I am useless with my hands. I'm not practical in any basis, but what I do know is how to advocate.
Okay.
I realised that the people who go through the legal system were people that I'd lived with and worked with for many years. So they were the poor, the downtrodden of this world who are re-victimised through the whole criminal justice system, and I wanted to stand beside them.
Given your own experience, is it okay to break the law?
Of course. Jesus broke the law in order to fulfil the law. I'm a very conventional person in a lot of ways. I mean, I don't speed, I don't have any other criminal convictions. When I decide to break the law, I hope that it's after a lot of time of reflection and grappling with things. And I hope it's to fulfil something greater.
We talked about the necessity defence before and how that might be a defence that could be used to support the Waihopai Three, for instance. But in the end, it didn't stand. What defence was successful?
What won it for the Waihopai ploughshares community was a claim of right. They understood they were damaging property, but they believed they were legally obliged to do this work, again to prevent a greater crime from occurring.
Do you find the accused, Peter Reginald Leo Murnane, guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Some people since got very nervous about that because they see it, I think, as potentially opening the floodgates to kind of...
Well, it was a real pity that the media only stayed for about a day, the first day, and didn't follow the evidence, because I think it would have been very clear had they followed the whole trial how this claim of right defence unfolded, because it took many days for it to unfold.
You can break into a house to save the kids if the house is on fire. That's not a guilty thing.
Unfortunately, there was a knee-jerk reaction, let's get rid of the claim of right defence. Now, the problem with that is that we have these defences in our legal system for very good reason. We continue to ask ourselves, how did the people of Germany allow the Nazis to continue what they were doing? Why didn't they do something to stop them? And this claim of right, these necessity defences, are put in place to stop the worst excesses of state violence. And when we try to get rid of them, unfortunately, then we lose what to me are the best aspects of our legal system. As a criminal lawyer, what better thing to argue is an argument of the greater good.
Do you think your Catholic educated children are condemned to becoming activists in their matriarchal tradition?
I hope that they don't see it as condemned. Look, all you can do, like, as a parent, what I have come to appreciate is all you can do is try to set the best example you can. And if my kids can understand that I tried and that it was a good journey in trying, and they can participate in that or they can support that, then, you know, I will be very, very happy and content.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.